Regaining consciousness in the swamp, the wealthy woman overheard her husband and mistress talking. But it was what her mother-in-law had done that made everyone shudder. Margaret was afraid to take even a step to the side, afraid it would be her last. Her legs were already submerged in the swamp up to her calves, and her autumn ankle boots offered no protection from the cold, just as her woolen dress and coat, soaked through by the rain, offered no respite. It was late autumn. The biting cold pierced her muscles from within, seizing them with cramps. Her legs were numb, but moving was impossible. What if, in another area, she sank into the swamp even faster? "Hey, somebody! Help!" Margaret was surprised by how weak and pained her voice sounded. She was young, full of strength, managing a huge business on her own, and not the type to shy away from challenges. But her body was betraying her. Her head felt like it was cracking open, as though filled with broken glass, and it kept spinning. She was incredibly thirsty, her mouth dry. Margaret even found herself thinking that she was ready to drink water straight from the swamp, but bending down or moving at all was dangerous. Plus, the water could contain harmful bacteria. And still, how did I end up here? No matter how hard Margaret tried to remember what had brought her into this swamp, the memories of the day seemed to have been erased as if by an eraser. Yesterday, she had been at the factory, waiting for some important client who wanted to view valuable tree species. But how had she ended up here? Margaret had never been fond of extreme adventures. She felt a dull pain in her leg. Sure enough, her left leg had sunk into the swamp faster than the right, and now she had to maintain her balance while the cold water burned her knee joint. A bird cried out in the distance with a frightening voice. It seemed as though Margaret had already entered hell, and this cry signaled that ghosts were about to drag her into the swamp or tear her to pieces. Fortunately, there was a small tree nearby that Margaret was holding onto. She felt herself drifting into sleep. Memories began to surface on the border between reality and dreams. They were so vivid it was almost frightening. They say that one's life flashes before their eyes just before death. First, she saw herself as a little girl, around 7 years old. Her light brown, wavy hair was braided with a decorative bow. Her extraordinarily blue eyes, just like her mother's, were filled with sadness as she looked at her red dress in the mirror. Even then, Margaret was taller than most children her age, and she already had an adult expression on her face. In fact, she had the demeanor of a little old lady. And she stayed that way, tall, thin, and always too serious under any circumstances, and she never cut her hair. "Mom, why are we going to Dad's birthday? He's a traitor, a bad person. He left us. You said so yourself." 6 months ago, her father had left the family. Her mother had said that she would never speak to him again or accept any help from him, but now, suddenly, she was dragging her to his new family, where there was a boy of her own age. "Margaret, please, don't tell Dad that I spoke badly about him. You understand, we just need to survive right now. I thought I could handle it on my own, but you can see, I'm a little sick." Mom had barely been able to walk for several months. She'd always had problems with her legs, and stress had made it worse. She couldn't work as a shop assistant like she had planned. Sometimes she took cleaning jobs, but even there, people complained that she worked too slowly, promising to fire her any minute. She didn't get upset. She would smile and say that she really did move like a turtle, so it was her own fault. "All right, Mom. But I don't love Dad anymore. He said on the phone that I'm no longer his daughter because you left him. But he left himself. Why is he lying? And can daughters really be ex-daughters?" Margaret asked. "Sweetheart, listen, you're still little. I can't explain all of this to you. It's just that Dad fell in love with another woman, but he's too ashamed to admit it, so he blames you and me. His conscience is sick, you could say." Mom asked her again not to say anything unnecessary to Dad on his birthday. Margaret had never been good at lying, so she just stayed silent throughout the whole celebration. Dad boasted that Tim, his son from Marie, was a very talented child. And for some reason, he looked at Margaret as if she was somehow to blame. Dad's new wife kept laughing in a silly way for no apparent reason. Margaret remembered her golden curls and bloodthirsty mouth, outlined with bright red lipstick, nothing else. That's how she stayed in her memory, just the hair and the laughing lips. She didn't even remember what Marie was wearing, she just didn't want to look at her. Dad said that unlike Mom, she kept herself in shape. After hearing this, Mom shrank into her chair and began humiliating herself in front of Dad, flattering him. Margaret whispered to her in the hallway, "Mom, let's go, we're not welcome here." But Mom asked to stay until the end of the birthday and, in the end, humbly begged Dad to pay child support if it wasn't too much trouble. Dad slammed his fist on the table and started yelling. So this is why you came? I thought you'd finally realized, wanted to apologize. It's because of you I left, you couldn't keep the family together. You even turned the kid against me. Margaret looks at me like I'm a wolf. You're getting nothing, just so you know. Run to the courts, since you couldn't show any womanly wisdom. But, Kevin, understand, I have health problems right now. I'm only asking for our daughter's sake. Mom continued to humiliate herself. At that moment, Marie walked into the room and deliberately said loudly, "Let me call a taxi for you, it seems like you're tired." "No, thank you, we'll manage." On the bus, Mom explained to Margaret that Dad wouldn't pay for the taxi, and they didn't have much money anyway. "Was it all for nothing?" the girl asked. "Well, no harm in trying," sighed her mother. Margaret disagreed with her, but didn't argue. She felt sorry for her mother. "You know, you're way better than Marie," the daughter said, trying to comfort her in some way. "And you're definitely better than that silly Tim," her mother smiled, and they both chuckled, remembering how the boy had tried to recite a poem but mixed up several words. The parents didn't correct him and continued to admire his genius. But Margaret's father never praised her, he was always dissatisfied with her. The girl thought that, perhaps, all of her father's compliments went to his new family, and she was just his practice. Then came hard times. Her mother struggled as best as she could, but her health didn't improve. When Margaret turned 9, they exchanged their apartment in a decent neighborhood for a one-bedroom flat on the outskirts, adding some extra money. "It's a shame to waste your grandmother's inheritance, but there's no other way," her mother said. They continued to live modestly, but alongside pasta, cheap sausages, and jam, more honored guests started to appear on their table, like cheese, cutlets, and sweets. "Mom, I don't mind. The main thing is just to be yourself." Margaret didn't complain about being teased as the gray mouse in her new school near their current home. She really did dress poorly. She had outgrown all her clothes, and new ones. She really did dress poorly. She had outgrown all her clothes, and there was simply no money to buy new ones. "I'm so stupid. My mother told me, why have a child after 40? But I did everything my own way," one day her mother said. "Do you regret that I was born?" the girl asked, upset. "No, of course not, my darling. You're the best thing in my life. But I regret choosing such an unreliable father for you. But if you had chosen someone else, you would have had someone else, not me." Margaret was unusually perceptive for her age. "You're right, my clever girl." "Okay then, I won't regret choosing him," her mother smiled. She had taken up handicrafts and began making bags at home on order. Gradually, they started to earn a little money, and her mother became more at ease, though her legs still gave way. It wasn't until Margaret was 18, when her mother suddenly passed away, that she learned her mother had knee prosthetics, and that her father had renounced his rights to her and never paid child support. "Don't cry. Your mother, she held on like a true heroine. That's what she said, I won't die until I raise my daughter," the doctor at the hospital said, as Margaret came to pick up her mother's body. She called her father and invited him to the funeral. Her mother had always hoped that he'd wake up to his conscience, but he never showed up. Margaret didn't feel upset about it, she didn't care anymore. She had long since crossed her father off her list of close family. Her mother used to say that even from a hopeless parent, one could learn something good. It's just that they don't show you how to do things right, but how not to do them. Margaret decided that she would never shirk responsibility or betray anyone, no matter what happened. She wouldn't be hypocritical or lie either. She hadn't inherited her mother's immense calmness and patience. She was impulsive, straightforward, and impatient, although she tried to fight these traits. But, thanks to her persistence, she managed to land a job as a secretary in a construction company, despite having no experience. A few years later, she dared to ask for a transfer to the managerial position. Her boss asked her, "Won't you regret it? A secretary's salary may not be high, but it's guaranteed. Managers work on commissions. The sums can be large, but nothing is guaranteed. Alex, I just need the money. So I'll manage." Her boss laughed at her bold statement and even told her that she could return to her old position if things didn't work out. But she didn't return. By the age of 24, she had become the head of the sales department and even bought an apartment in the same neighborhood where she had once lived with her mother. Later, she visited her mother's grave. "Well, I fixed everything. Don't worry, Mom. I have the same kind of apartment that Grandma left us." At the cemetery, Margaret met a tall, narrow-shouldered blond man in a black coat. He approached her. "Is this your mother?" "Yes, and my grandmother is here too," Margaret said. "I lost my wife." "I'm Eric," the stranger said. "Such a great loss, and you're so young." Margaret sympathized with him. "Actually, I'm already 38. I just look younger, you know." "You know what? How about we meet again sometime?" the man suggested after their brief conversation. Margaret thought for a moment and agreed. Her relationships never seemed to work out. Helen, her friend, joked that she was married to her career, and that was true. Childhood memories wouldn't let her rest. Margaret wanted to build a very large and reliable safety net. She was quite beautiful, with a good figure, but somehow she couldn't make relationships work. Some people thought she was obsessed with money and her career, while others didn't like that she was too serious. It turned out that serious men didn't want to date a career woman, and those who were looking for relationships without commitments weren't interesting to Margaret anymore. She wanted to get married for life to a good person and have children. As for work, she wasn't really obsessed with it. It was just that there was nothing else to focus on. But it wasn't like she was going to clubs or karaoke. All those ways of wasting life didn't interest her. Margaret didn't even have any bad habits. To her surprise, Eric didn't mind that she worked a lot. He even said, "My mother scolds me for that too. She says I've been a widower for 2 years. It's time to get a wife. She's really hoping for grandchildren." "Do you want children?" Margaret asked. "Of course, how could I not? I'll be a great father. My late wife, Irma, didn't want to have kids, and I loved her too much to force her to do something she didn't want," Eric confessed. Margaret found that very sweet. And when she met his mother shortly afterward, she was completely charmed. "This is exactly the kind of serious girl I wanted for my son." Gloria approved of Margaret's career ambitions, as well as the fact that she was studying to become an economist in the evening. They had a lovely chat. Margaret talked about her mother, and Gloria even got teary-eyed. Eric was attentive. He courted her for a whole year, not rushing to take their relationship to the bedroom. They talked a lot, and that was also endearing. So when the man proposed, Margaret thought, why look for better when you have good, and agreed. It couldn't be said that she was wildly in love, but at that point, she could imagine spending her whole life with him. Eric seemed reliable, straightforward, from a good family. But after about 6 months, the arguments began. Her husband started coming home late, and then he even began to occasionally not come home at all. Gloria defended her son, saying he was struggling with the loss of his job and that he just needed some time to get himself together. Everything would work out. "But he smells like perfume. And I don't wear such overpowering fragrance," Margaret exclaimed. "Oh, darling, what are you talking about? Smart wives don't pry into such secrets." Anything can happen. Her mother-in-law replied with a mysterious smile. Another 6 months passed, and Eric still hadn't found a job. That's when Margaret gave him an ultimatum. Either you get your act together, or we're getting a divorce. She clearly remembered how her father's departure had started. He had stopped working too, and it later turned out he was spending his free time with his Marie, the daughter of a government official who lived off her father's money. Listen, Margaret, if we're being honest, I've never made any claims about the fact that you can't have children. I never even hinted that you were incomplete. Didn't you think it was because of you that I'm stressed out? Eric asked. Margaret's hand started to shake, buzzing. She wanted to slap him. He had been living off her money for a year and was still making demands, but she held herself back, only saying, paling, "If something's bothering you, get out of my apartment and go live with your mom. Listen, why should we fight? Misunderstandings happen in every family. Let's try to fix everything. I'll try to find a job and not stay out late, and you think about the family," Eric said. Margaret didn't tell her husband that after the medical examination, the doctors had told her that she didn't have many chances of getting pregnant. She needed surgery to remove a fibroid, but it was quite risky. She felt guilty, so she stopped picking on him for still coming home late once a week. At least he'd found a job, that was something. It turns out I've been lying to him. I promised to have children, we talked about it in advance, and now I won't admit the problem is with me, Margaret thought, and secretly started preparing for the surgery. Meanwhile, she threw herself into work with such energy that she was given the task of heading the company's branch. Her boss even said, "If you keep going at this pace, you can expect to become a shareholder. Your branch's profit is twice as high as the others. It's surprising, you're so young." "Thank you, Alex." This news didn't exactly make Margaret happy. If only she could get pregnant, that would be happiness. But even after the surgery, nothing worked out with having children, so all that was left was to focus on her career. And so, by the time she was 26, Margaret had become a businesswoman. Eric, although he said he liked ambitious women, felt jealous and resentful. One time, while drunk, he blurted out that he had cheated and would continue to cheat. "I'm getting back at you for stifling my masculine energy. You've become a man in a skirt." Later, he denied it, saying she had imagined it. Margaret responded, "Listen, Eric, we need to admit that it's not working. You cheat, you're jealous, I can't have children. We've hit a dead end, we need to go our separate ways." To Margaret's surprise, after this conversation, her husband's behavior changed dramatically. Eric became like silk. He came home right after work, sometimes cooked and cleaned the apartment, gave her compliments, and on weekends, he invited her on romantic dates. It was like a different person. It was hard to recognize him. "What's going on? I don't understand." Margaret was astonished. "You know, when you said I might lose you, I got really scared. So what if we don't have kids? It doesn't matter. The most important thing is that you're with me. If you want, we can adopt someone. I'll do anything for you. I'm sorry, I've been a pig. Now I want to make things right, live with you till the end. Will you give me another chance?" Eric even knelt before her in the cafe where he had invited her for this conversation. Margaret was struck. Well, at least he knows how to admit his mistakes. Not all is lost. She thought that to herself, but still grimaced when her husband once again said he'd forgotten his wallet and card. Margaret never asked him for a single cent, yet Eric constantly borrowed money from her for gifts for his mother or for other things and never paid her back. She bought the groceries, paid the utilities, they lived in her apartment, and she had done all the repairs herself. Of course, it seemed like a small thing, she earned enough money, but still, it was somehow humiliating that she was the one paying even for their sweet date. Eric had invited her, by all rules, he should have paid. But the evening was so wonderful, the words so sweet, that Margaret decided not to spoil the moment, even though just the day before, she had promised herself to have a serious talk with her husband about all of this. The idyll had lasted for several months. Sometimes there were warning signs when Margaret noticed the sideways glances between Eric and his mother, but she tried not to pay attention to it. Eric even introduced her to Julia, a wealthy client who was planning to purchase a large amount of valuable timber for her father's business. Yes, that's right, it was with her that Margaret had met yesterday, and now she had woken up here, in the swamp. How could this have happened? Margaret snapped out of her thoughts when she heard voices nearby. She was about to call for help again when she suddenly recognized her husband's voice and heard him talking about her with some unfamiliar woman with a shrill voice. You know, sending Margaret to the next world was a brilliant idea. I'm so tired of pretending to be the perfect husband. There was nothing left to do, she had already wanted to divorce me, Eric laughed. Yeah, she's so naive. She immediately believed I was a rich client, didn't ask any questions. All that was left was to slip the medicine you gave me into her tea, and your wife, like under hypnosis, went off to supposedly inspect the forests, the woman replied. Yeah, you have nothing to worry about. You were wearing a wig with dark hair, you did a bold makeup, and you used a different name. Holly, you're a genius, you played it all like clockwork, said her husband. It's all thanks to you. I'm sure you keep your promises. After your first wife, Irma, you honestly gave me the apartment, though it took 2 years. And no matter how you spin it, I'm your only steady woman, even though you still haven't married me, Holly replied. Listen, I couldn't have given Irma the property earlier, that would have been suspicious. I had to fight with my mom about it, she didn't know, though she was very happy that we got Irma's apartment. You remember, before that we were living in a dorm. But things are getting better, Eric said cheerfully and casually. Margaret began to recall what they were talking about. Of course. After her husband recommended the client, she had gone to the meeting. Margaret vaguely remembered that the woman was heavily made up and wearing something red. Then they really drank tea, but after that, she remembered nothing. She woke up here, in the swamp. How can they talk so calmly about my death and my property? Tears streamed down Margaret's face. Both of her legs were already buried in the swamp up to her knees. She was afraid to move. Right now, she truly didn't know if she was shaking from the cold or from the horror of these cynical people. At one point, the husband she had thought was boastful, not very faithful, but otherwise harmless and even a little loving, had turned into some kind of monster. It turned out that his first wife had not left this world on her own. Just wait a little longer, you'll stay here forever. The voices of her husband and his mistress were fading, but Margaret still strained to hear their words. On one hand, she desperately wanted to go deaf and die, but on the other, she longed to survive, just to spite them. So much for choosing a reliable husband. If she had married the first man who came along, it would have been better. Even her own father now seemed like an innocent angel compared to Eric. How foolish she had been to get angry at her mother for choosing such a father for her. Well, you can't always see what you're getting, that had been proven many times. Maybe with age, she would gain more experience. But by then, she wouldn't really need a husband anyway. You're moving up, Eric. Margaret will leave behind more money than Irma. At this rate, we'll be dollar millionaires. Seems like you haven't lost your charm with age. Holly continued to gloat. I hope Margaret's inheritance is enough to last us a lifetime together. I'll leave a little for my mother, and we'll head off to some tropical island. Then I'll finally marry you and be rewarded for all my suffering, Eric said with theatrical flair. Oh, don't exaggerate your suffering. Both of those dead women were quite decent, really, Holly replied, flirting with him in the most grotesque way. Their voices were chilling, laughing as if nothing had happened, indifferent to the fact that they had destroyed 2 people. Stop. I'm not dead yet. I have to fight, Margaret told herself. Her husband seemed to sense her thoughts and anxiously asked Holly, Are you sure she won't make it out? Will she sink into the swamp? Maybe we should have just hit her over the head and drowned her. Who would have found her? Eric asked. Oh no, that's too dark. A body could be found, and the blame would fall on us. This way, I just told her that heading in this direction would lead to the highway and made sure your Margaret walked into the swamp. Only someone who knows this forest well could get out of there, and she's here for the first time." Holly spoke with the tone of an expert, casually and indifferently, as if she were talking about something amusing rather than death. Eric asked something else, but Margaret didn't hear his words anymore. They were moving quickly away, still arguing about whether she had drowned immediately or regained consciousness before her demise. "I'm not dead yet, but there's no way out. I can't get out of here." Suddenly, an overwhelming sense of emptiness engulfed Margaret, and she began to sob loudly. Her tormentors were gone and couldn't enjoy her suffering. Even if they heard her, they wouldn't risk coming back to this dangerous place. They would just wait until she was gone. Margaret started praying, begging the heavens to somehow lead her out of there. And suddenly, she believed that a miracle was possible if she believed hard enough. It seemed as though someone invisible asked her, "And what next? What will you live for?" Margaret thought that this quiet voice might be the beginning of a fevered delirium, but she answered just in case, "I'll help someone who's in a worse situation." As soon as she said this, she heard a buzzing sound above her. "Well, that's it, I'm definitely delirious. The medicine must still be affecting me. And I probably caught a cold. And anyway, it's so terrifying. You can die from fear, not just from being sick." These thoughts were racing through her mind. Still, Margaret looked up and, to her surprise, saw a drone. It looked strange, unlike any she had seen before, as if someone had put it together by hand from makeshift materials. And although the flying device clearly couldn't save her, Margaret suddenly felt a spark of hope that someone local might notice her predicament. "Hey! I'm here. I'm sinking in the swamp. If anyone can hear me, help." Margaret knew it was foolish, but she decided to take the chance. The drone, resembling a giant May beetle, descended lower, as if inspecting her, then suddenly froze right above her. It then dropped even lower, almost to the ground. "Are kids playing around here?" thought Margaret. But upon looking closer, she noticed the drone was hovering over a hummock she hadn't seen before for some reason. "Are you showing me the way?" Margaret asked. The drone buzzed and moved to the next hummock, as if confirming her thoughts. "All right. Even if I've lost my mind, I still have to try to save myself," said Margaret, and she tried to pull her right leg out, which was stuck in the swamp, though slightly less than her left. The swampy water released her with a heavy sucking sound, like a toothless mouth that had forgotten to insert its jaw. Margaret stepped onto the hummock the drone had pointed to and continued holding onto a small tree. She was very afraid of slipping, but despite not succeeding on the first try, she managed to free her left leg, letting out a sigh of relief. This could already be called a victory. "Just don't leave me now," Margaret said to the drone. She still couldn't quite believe her luck, but the flying device was guiding her along an unknown, hidden path. She moved forward slowly, step by step. After about 20 minutes, she found a long stick and started using it like a staff to lean on. It helped balance her cold, stiff legs. Half an hour later, exhaustion suddenly overwhelmed Margaret with all its fury. She desperately wanted to sleep, her teeth chattering from the cold. Suddenly, it didn't matter anymore whether she would survive or die, but on autopilot, she kept moving forward, step by step, until the full moon in the sky began to pale. It seemed that dawn was approaching. Margaret was about to give up when, suddenly, she saw smoke rising in the distance behind the tall trees. She realized there were people living there. And that meant the swamp was almost over. The woman gathered her last strength, a second wind opened up. She kept going, ignoring her exhaustion. Margaret really wanted to live. No, she had overcome everything not to leave the money to Eric and his mistress. She would survive, in spite of everything. When Margaret finally emerged into a clearing, she collapsed from exhaustion. Although she could see a small house in the distance behind the trees, she could no longer make it to it, just crumpled to the ground. She didn't care that she was soaking wet, or that the grass was damp and the earth was cold. She had reached the limit of her strength. All she could do was hope that the owners of the drone lived nearby and would find her. Margaret fell into unconsciousness and awoke to the sound of a child's voice. "Dad, I can't lift her. She's skinny, but long." "Not long, she's tall, son," replied a man's voice. Then the child held up a bottle with a sharp smell to her nose. Margaret woke up and opened her eyes. She was still lying on the grass, and next to her was a blond, curly-haired boy about 10 years old. He looked exactly like his father, who was staring at her with his steely gray eyes, hardly blinking. Then he said, "You have to help us. You see for yourself, I can't walk, and JACL is still little. Try to get up and lean on my wheelchair." "Dad, I'm not little," the child protested. "Well, then help the lady get up," the father smiled. The boy strained with all his might, and Margaret felt uncomfortable. She summoned all her strength and, after falling several times, finally managed to get up. She leaned on the back of the wheelchair, just as the stranger had suggested. More precisely, she practically hung on it in him. "I'm sorry, I can't do more right now. Please be patient with me," Margaret said. As she looked closely at him in the first light of dawn, she saw that the stranger was quite young, definitely no older than 30. He was broad-shouldered, rosy-cheeked, and would have appeared to be in excellent health, if not for the fact that he had no legs. "It's okay. Do you know the legend about the man without legs and the blind man?" he asked Margaret. She shook her head. The man explained that, once upon a time, in the forest, a man without legs and a blind man had come together to die. The first man couldn't walk, and the second couldn't see where to step or where to find food. Fortunately, they met. The blind man was strong. He put the man without legs on his shoulders, and together they hunted and survived. The man finished the story. Margaret suddenly realized that she had been saved by good people, and so, when they reached the hut, she boldly stepped inside and relaxed even more upon seeing the modest surroundings. This man, he could be anyone, but definitely not a bandit. "By the way, my name is Lester." "And yours?" the man asked. "Margaret," she replied. "Well, let's get you something to eat. Jack, bring some dry clothes." "Sorry, we don't have anything for women. My wife left me when I froze my feet off." Lester explained that a couple of years ago, he was a gamekeeper, and a very principled one at that. He was ambushed by poachers who had been after him for a long time and shot him in the legs. It was winter. Lester crawled several kilometers to the hut without his outer clothing, which they had taken, leaving him to die. In the end, he survived, but lost his legs. "Maybe my clothes will fit you." The boy handed her some jeans and a sweater. They actually fit quite well. "See? And you say little. I told you, I've already grown," Jack said proudly. "All right, I won't argue. But I'm still better at building drones," smiled his father. "We go to a club. There's a village about 10 kilometers from here. And I made this drone myself." The boy proudly showed the very same flying device that had saved Margaret's life, adding, "It's not the prettiest, but it doesn't fail. I already realized that. You're my savior, after all." Margaret felt like hugging and kissing the sweet boy, but she was afraid she might scare him. Here comes some woman from the swamp, and now she wants to kiss me. And I didn't sleep. I love watching the swamp in the evening. Dad even jokingly calls me a water spirit. And it wasn't for nothing. Jack kept talking for a long time about how he spotted the woman, how he told his dad, and how his dad advised him to move the drone from one tussock to another. The boy was worried that the battery wouldn't last, but it all worked out. "Yes, son, that's a great story. But Margaret needs to rest. Here, drink this and lie down." Lester handed her a flask. She coughed as the taste of herbs and alcohol hit her mouth. There was quite a lot of alcohol in it. "Don't worry, drink it all, you need it now. Looks like you have a fever. We'll figure something out tomorrow. I'll keep an eye on you," Lester said, promising not to go to sleep in case the guest's condition worsened. Jack kept wanting to run for a doctor, but his father was afraid to let the boy go alone. And Margaret seemed to be feeling bad, but there was no wheezing in her lungs. For the intoxication, Lester had given her a tincture. He knew about herbs and was confident that this miracle liquid could revive even the dead. For the next few days, Margaret stayed in bed. By the fourth day, she felt better and was even able to go outside for some fresh air. I see you're getting better. Don't think I'm being nosy, but how did you end up on the swamp with poisoning symptoms and in city clothes? I really need to know in order to help you, said Lester. I still can't believe all of this isn't a dream. But here's what happened. Margaret told the whole story, including the conversation she overheard. She added that she has no evidence of her husband's attack, so she couldn't exactly go to the police. And now, after what she heard, she's afraid to go back home. Yes, they sound like dangerous people. You know what? If you're not feeling too bad here, stay as long as you need to, and then we'll figure out what to do, suggested Lester. And Jack's really gotten attached to you too. Lester went on to explain that the boy had a bad relationship with his biological mother, since in recent years she started drinking and generally didn't remember where she was or what she was doing. But now she was doing well. She had recovered from her addiction, married, and decided to start over, giving up her rights to Jack. Did you love her? Margaret asked, then blushed and felt embarrassed. What business is it of hers? What a question. It's fine, it's already healed. Yes, of course, Linda was my first and only love. We even dreamed of getting married when we were kids. Her parents drank, but I hoped she wouldn't follow in their footsteps. Varya held on as long as she could, then she fell. But now everything is okay. Lester explained that he had even paid for his wife's treatment for her addiction. And there, she met her doctor and decided to marry him. Maybe it's a good thing that she didn't have such a great relationship with Jack, or it would have hurt him even more, Margaret said. Well, I really struggled with the boy. I started taking him to a drone club to distract him from the horrible thoughts that his mother abandoned him and that he was unwanted. In the end, I remembered that I had a talent for technology. My father was an avid radio enthusiast, said Lester, and explained that he wasn't Jack's biological father, but his stepfather. Jack's mother married him because he was able to connect with the boy, whereas no one else had been able to. My Jack is like an angel compared to me. The perfect child. Just don't tell him that, Lester laughed and added, you know, when I first saw you, I thought the late mother had come back. But then I looked closely and realized you're much younger. I think we were meant to save you. Yeah. You're lucky to have such a wonderful son. I always dreamed of having a child, but it never worked out. First, I focused on my career, always afraid I'd end up a homeless woman, even though there didn't seem to be any sign of that. And then, I just couldn't do it, no matter how hard I tried, Margaret confided. I think it's not a bad thing that you didn't have a child with your husband, Lester sighed. Margaret simply nodded. Yes, of course, he was right. Still, her heart ached when she saw Jack. She couldn't help but imagine that he was her child. For a moment, she even wished she could stay in this little cabin forever, cooking meals, checking homework, listening to Jack and Lester's funny stories. But it was clear that this was impossible. Meanwhile, day by day, she saw Jack off to the bus that took him to the district school and later picked him up. Lester treated her with tenderness. Sometimes Margaret even felt that there was something more between them than just mutual affection. But she thought it would be improper to flirt with him. What if she was wrong? Maybe she simply liked him as a person. No, it would be too humiliating to confess her feelings and then find out they weren't mutual. Several months passed, and the spring sun was already warming up. Green buds had appeared on the trees, and nature was coming back to life, but Margaret felt sad knowing that sooner or later she would have to leave this house and the people who had become almost like family to her. Margaret, look! Jack rushed into the house, out of breath, waving a newspaper. What happened? Did you win another contest? Margaret put the pies in the oven, removed her apron, and turned around. No, look. It says here that you drowned in the swamp, supposedly an accident, and they didn't find your body, and your husband is devastated. The boy pointed to the article. Indeed, the newspaper made it sound as though she had gone to show the forest and never returned. There was no mention of any attack, as expected. Margaret, you need to go to the city. I'll give you some money, you can stay in a hotel. But you'll need to change clothes first. Look, wear this, and everyone will think you're a beggar, and they won't pay any attention to you. Lester handed her an outfit that, indeed, was hard to look at without tears. Where did you get all this from? Margaret was surprised. Oh, I told the grandmothers in the village that I needed old clothes for rags. They gave me this. I'll go with Margaret, in case anyone tries to hurt her, Jack volunteered. The father nodded approvingly but asked not to be seen nearby, so no one would guess that this was the woman they had taken in. Someone might see that Margaret is staying with us, and then because of you, they'll recognize her. I got it, I'm not a kid. Jack accompanied Margaret to a spot where the bus stop was visible, made sure she got on the bus, and sighed. He had hoped that he and his dad would fall in love with each other and Margaret would stay with them forever. But it wasn't meant to be. Not a gypsy, huh? Asked one of the passengers, pulling her bag closer. Who knows? You can't tell them apart these days. But she could probably swipe something, replied an elderly man. Exactly. Last time, some beggar-looking woman was riding the bus, and then my tomatoes disappeared from my stroller bag, said a middle-aged man in a cap with a mustache. Hey, driver. Drop her off, or you'll be responsible for the theft, said a plump woman, the first to raise a panic in the bus. What do you mean? I already paid for my ticket, Margaret protested. We'll give you your money back, and ours will be safer, said the man with the mustache. All right, stop making a scene. I'll let you off somewhere further down the road, just to be safe, the driver, with a red face, responded. He grabbed Margaret by the arm, stuffed her fare into her pocket, and then suddenly noticed that the beggar's nails were unusually neat. But what really struck Victor, the bus driver, wasn't even that, but the little detail on her index finger. His wife, Natalie, worked in an expensive nail salon in the city and always put a neat sticker with a beautiful rhinestone in the shape of a ruby on one of her fingers. Natalie called it a drop of luxury. Look, just sit in the front seat so you don't scare the passengers. The driver changed his mind about kicking the stranger off and decided to question her. The passengers murmured, but since they couldn't be robbed by the dangerous beggar anymore, they calmed down fairly quickly. And Victor asked her where she got the manicure. You see, I was at your wife's salon, and I loved that rhinestone. And even though I did the manicure myself, I reapplied it to remind myself of former luxury, Margaret confessed. Margaret confessed and also mentioned that she needed to find somewhere to stay in the city for a while, but without anyone finding out about it. So you're the one? Victor exclaimed in surprise. His wife often talked about a wealthy client who left the most generous tips. He also remembered the newspaper article that said she had died in the swamp. And now he realized the businesswoman was right in front of him. Please, keep it down. It's not that simple, and I need to stay quiet for now. Margaret whispered. All right, you can stay at our house, Victor offered. Margaret was relieved. In a hotel, she might be recognized, but in a private home, she could feel safer. Besides, Natalie, the manicurist, was a pleasant woman. No, I won't take any money from you. Natalie waved her hands when she realized she had to help, but Margaret thought it would be better if she had taken the money rather than asking so many questions. Natalie was quite talkative, and Margaret had to answer her detailed questions since there was nowhere else to go. I won't tell anyone anything, Natalie promised, but Margaret wasn't sure she believed her. A couple of days later, Margaret overheard Natalie whispering to a friend about how the businesswoman was hiding in her house, and everyone thought she had died. Well, I really should rent an apartment or stay at a hotel, or else Natalie will tell the whole world, thought Margaret, not realizing how right she was. The person Natalie was talking to wasn't just any friend, it was Holly, her husband Eric's mistress. "Natalie, thank you for your hospitality, but I'll be moving tomorrow," Margaret said politely. She felt a terrible unease, but couldn't explain why. It seemed rude to leave without warning after being welcomed so kindly, so she decided to tell them everything. "Oh, what a shame." "Well, if you've made up your mind." Natalie immediately ran outside and called Holly, telling her that there was no time to waste and they had to act that very night. Holly had long been gathering information about wealthy clients from Natalie. Natalie didn't make much from her manicure work but earned more from her informant activities. Although Natalie knew that Margaret was in real danger, she decided not to get into details. She just wanted to quickly save up for a comfortable old age, rather than saving lives. That night, Margaret tossed and turned for a long time, unable to fall asleep. Around 1 a.m., she finally dozed off, but suddenly sprang up in bed. She thought someone was climbing through the window. There was no one suspicious there, but she heard Natalie talking to someone on the phone. She's still not asleep, tossing around. "I should have given her some sleeping pills." Yes, once she falls asleep, I'll tell your Eric, then you can take her. But we need to knock her out with something stronger. I wouldn't risk it myself." "All right, you know what you owe me, as always. If you get caught by the police for her murder, I'm not involved." "I read the newspapers, yeah." Terror and panic washed over Margaret. So, her husband knows she's alive, and now they plan to kidnap her. But this time, she wouldn't survive, and she had to run now. Margaret waited a moment, then quietly cracked open the window and jumped out. Fortunately, the old sneakers and the beggar's clothes were still in the room. Natalie had bought her new clothes, but they were in the living room. It was too dangerous to go there. Margaret walked down the street, crying. Her eyes were red, and in her ragged clothes, she looked clearly insane. People recoiled from her like she was a leper. The only thing missing were the bells that jingle when walking, but Margaret didn't care. She breathed in the fresh air, rejoicing that she was once again alive, that she had won again. She pulled the hood of her old jacket tightly around her face and decided to head toward the office. Even in these rags, the security would still let her in, and from there, she would act according to the circumstances. On the phone, Natalie was talking about some negotiations that Margaret should not attend. And as Margaret understood, this meeting was supposed to take place today, and that's when she would surprise them all. Let Eric not think of himself as the boss and the rich heir. She was still alive and would stand up for her rights. They wouldn't succeed in burying her prematurely. Well, lucky I woke up. Margaret thought with horror, realizing that if she had been asleep, they would have already taken her somewhere where she would meet her death. With bitterness, Margaret reflected that no one cared about her now. No one had even tried to search for her. Then, suddenly, the images of Lester and Jack appeared in her mind, and she smiled. It seemed that, there, she was truly loved and awaited. For some reason, Margaret felt more certain of this now than ever before. She entered through the back door, entered the code she knew, and passed by the sleeping guard. Then she hid in the conference room's inner chamber, a place known to very few. Fortunately, a spare suit was still hanging in the closet. It came with a pristine white blouse and shoes. Margaret also found wet wipes in a desk drawer and freshened up as much as she could. She then lay down on the couch for a quick nap, only to wake up from the sound of voices. As the representative of the deceased, I will decide who to sell the company to and for how much, Eric was saying. But you don't understand anything about business, the manager argued with him. I advise you to be quiet, or I'll throw you out first. Eric shouted. Then the voices of foreigners could be heard, apparently discussing the details of the deal as they wanted to buy the company. Well, we don't want to drag this out. Are you ready to sign the contract? One of the foreigners asked. Of course, but the money should be transferred today, Eric replied. The investor agreed. Margaret realized that there was no more time to wait and rushed out of the hidden room. She quickly threw on her jacket to run directly toward the foreigners, hoping Eric wouldn't recognize her. Standing before German and David, Margaret swiftly removed her hood and, and a clear voice said, "My husband tried to kill me, but I'm still alive. You shouldn't deal with a traitor." "Security. Security. Get her out of here. She's gone crazy. That's why I kept it a secret that she was alive," Eric screamed. But the guards hesitated to touch their boss. She didn't seem insane. However, her husband certainly looked like a madman. He was trembling with rage, his face red, as if he were about to explode like an overripe tomato. After collecting himself a little, Eric realized he was now irrelevant to everyone and tried to escape. But Margaret had already given orders to the security to stop him and call the police. "Oh, so it's really you, Margaret? I thought I was imagining things." "Sorry, I dreamed of you this morning, in the form of a beggar," said one of the guards. "Yes, I did show up a bit differently this morning, but now, out of my whole collection, only this cloak remains," Margaret smiled. She had won again. There was a lot of work to be done. Without any transition, Margaret threw herself into the tasks at hand. She had to restore the company's operations and reclaim her good name, as well as keep up with police interrogations. Her husband would soon stand trial. The verdict hadn't been delivered yet. Deciding to take advantage of a brief break, Margaret went to pick up Lester and Jack. "You've helped me so much, and now I want to do something for you. Lester, let's get you a good prosthesis. Nowadays, you'll be able to walk. Well, of course, not exactly like with your own legs, but pretty close. And Jack needs a good education," she suggested. "Margaret, I'm sorry, don't get me wrong. I'd even marry you, but I don't want to live off a woman. Look at you and look at me." Lester sighed. Margaret blushed. So, he really did like her. That was all she could think about now. "Lester, listen, everything is still pretty unstable for me, probably not as sweet as it seems, which is why I'm rushing to help. And since we're both talking about it, I'd like to marry you, too." Margaret decided not to miss the moment. Lester blushed deeply. He hesitated for a moment, then said, "All right, if you're not lying about your feelings and not trying to trap me, we can give it a try. But just so you know, I need a wife for life." "So do I." Margaret kissed him on the cheek. They both feared that Jack wouldn't want to leave the forest house, but the child reacted to the changes with excitement. "Wow. I bet there are some awesome drone models in the city. I'll join the city's DIY competitions. But that's not even the most important thing. Dad, are you really going to marry Margaret?" "Sorry, I overheard a bit." Lester nodded awkwardly. Margaret smiled. Well, it had worked out. She hadn't wanted to push, but in the end, she had backed him into a corner and almost forced him to propose. Now, Lester and his son were living with her as guests. There was plenty of space in her spacious apartment. "Well, if you're not used to it here, we could exchange it for a house in time," she said. "I think the most important thing is that you feel good," Jack answered for everyone, and Lester agreed with him. The days passed quickly. Jack had, indeed, sent in his application for the competition first thing and was anxiously awaiting the results. His drone could fly for a long time without needing to recharge, and it was practically indestructible. Even if it fell, it was fine. The boy was hoping for a prize, and his father believed it would happen. Everything was going well, even, one could say, wonderfully. But then, Margaret's almost former mother-in-law, Gloria, was hit with a spring flare-up and refused to believe that her son could have been planning a murder. "You made all this up. You're a fraud, and I'll prove it," said the mother-in-law. "Listen, I know you're not aware, but Irma didn't die of natural causes either. Your son is far from being an innocent lamb." Margaret told her everything she had overheard that day in the swamp. "Slander. I won't spare any money," was the mother-in-law's response. "But we've never had a conflict. Why don't you believe me?" Margaret asked. "Don't you get it? He's my son, and I'll save him. There are smart people who've given me advice." Her mother-in-law hinted that her son had sent a lawyer, and they would accuse Margaret of fraud. And what exactly would that be? Margaret was surprised. You'll find out in court. I'm not on your side. Her mother-in-law slammed the door and never returned. Jack said that she was a very mean woman and it was better not to get involved with her. The boy turned out to be right. In court, her mother-in-law and the lawyer twisted everything around. Supposedly, Margaret had wrongly accused her husband, perhaps to cover up some shady dealings in the company, or even brought an illegitimate child and, for some reason, a disabled man with no legs. He was clearly her accomplice. One thing is clear, no one attacked her. This Margaret is just a sly lady, and it's still unknown how she made her money. Obviously, she decided to discredit my son, and he's completely defenseless against this rich woman, Gloria said in court, even dabbing her tears with a handkerchief. For some reason, the journalists believed the elderly woman. Everyone liked the idea that the cunning businesswoman had deceived a good man, her husband. The move devised by the clever lawyer worked, especially because some of the reporters had been bribed in advance, and now Margaret was facing a legal battle. Margaret, how are you? I don't know. Some are on my side. Others believe that Eric is an innocent victim of my deception, she sighed. Margaret, we didn't come here for nothing. Look at this. The boy showed a recording on his phone, which he had captured with the drone in the swamp. In it, Margaret was struggling to pull herself out of the swamp, one step at a time. So this is new evidence. Margaret kissed Lester and Jack in front of everyone. The footage really helped convince the doubters that Margaret had been in mortal danger and hadn't made anything up. Her mother-in-law lost the case. She gritted her teeth in fury and cursed her daughter-in-law, but the curses didn't work. Margaret was beginning a new life. This, however, only concerned her personal plans. She and Lester had decided to get married, and Jack had already agreed that she could adopt him. But you need to know something about me. I have nothing left except this apartment. Eric stole from me. All the money was funneled into offshore accounts, and it looks like I'll have to say goodbye to it. Margaret said. At first, amidst all the chaos, she hadn't noticed the theft, but now everything became clear. They hadn't paid for the equipment leasing, they had simply stolen it. She barely managed to pay the salaries and was preparing to shut down the company. The only silver lining was that at least she was leaving with zero debt. Well, that's another reason for you to marry me, Lester beamed. He had been troubled by the thought that Margaret might think he was some kind of freeloader. So, oddly enough, her bankruptcy came in quite handy. Jack, I think it's the right time to tell Margaret our news, said Lester. His son blushed with pleasure. We're about to get a big grant. Our drone caught the attention of a company that makes robots, and they want to buy the patent for the invention. Wow! That must be a huge amount of money. And then your dad can get the most modern prosthetics. Margaret exclaimed when she saw the sum, with many zeros. And also, if you want, you can start a business again. We'll sponsor you. Jack agrees, said Lester. Of course, we're family. One helps the other, and vice versa. Just like in Dad's story about the lame and the blind, the boy cheered. Margaret and Lester celebrated their wedding fairly modestly, and although Margaret's new business was growing, it wasn't expanding very quickly. She decided to save money. Plus, some of the funds were being set aside for Jack's education and travel. The talented boy amazed everyone with his thirst for knowledge, and a bright future was clearly ahead of him. He received several more grants in a short time. Eric didn't want to sit in prison alone, so he betrayed his mistress. He hated Holly for secretly sneaking away with the stolen goods and not sharing any with him. It was clear that she had planned the scheme in advance. However, the money didn't go to Holly's benefit. During the short time she was free, Holly met a charming gigolo. He introduced himself as an investor and promised to invest her money with high returns. He pretended to be a wealthy foreigner, but then simply disappeared with the money. It turned out that the thief had stolen from another thief. The lovers had a falling out, and both testified against each other. Margaret's former mother-in-law even later apologized to her. She was deeply concerned for her son and had planned to wait for him. I don't know how I gave birth to and raised such a monster, but this is my cross to bear, she said. I understand, Gloria, and I forgive you. But let's not keep in touch anymore, Margaret suggested. Only the day before, Margaret had learned that she was pregnant. She decided that she couldn't allow herself to worry, not just during the pregnancy, but in life in general. Her time had come, to love, to nurture, and to rejoice.